All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. In this lesson, we're going to discuss how to look for meaning, quote, beyond the text. So this is a lesson on how to unlock the greater meanings and significance of literature. I.e., it's a lesson on why a story or a text is more than just a story. If you've read a book before, you've probably read it at face value. And by face value, I mean you read it for the story, you understood where the story was going, you followed the plot, whatever that might be, and then you enjoyed kind of the adventure that the story took you on. And that's a perfectly fine way to enjoy literature or to enjoy a text. However, when we talk about literary analysis, we're moving to a new place in literature where we are not just focused on the plot, what happens, but what that actually means for me as a person in the world, as a person in society. So that's what I mean when we're talking about more than just a story. It's a commentary on the way society is, on the way things are. So in this slide, we're talking about interpretation, what analyzing a text really means. So when you analyze a text, you examine all its little parts that make up the whole. You examine them to see if the text or the story provides a discussion or a commentary, and this isn't always a literal discussion, about reality, about our world and the way it works, and where we all fit in that world, in our world. So the question that you need to keep in mind, and the most important part of this lesson today, is the following question in blue. How do patterns of content and language shape the portrayal of the topic, and how do relationships between those patterns convey underlying meaning? Now there are a lot of big words and kind of important concepts going on here, so let's take a look at the next slide to kind of break it down a little bit. So this is the essential question again. How do patterns of content and language shape the portrayal of the topic, and how do relationships between those patterns convey underlying meaning, or plural meanings? And our key words here are patterns, content, language, convey, which is a verb, and underlying meaning. So let's start with patterns, and we're talking really about patterns of content and language. Well, what's a pattern? Well, it's anything that repeats itself, right? But in literature, that can be a little trickier to find. It's not just going to be literal repeating. It might be repetition of ideas, themes, topics, things like that. So we're looking for patterns of both content and language. So when you're dealing with a story, with a book, with an artwork even, the content is what you read or what you see. So for example, the story of the Three Little Pigs, the content is the three little pigs and the wolf having their conflict, where the wolf comes around the piggy neighborhood and blows all the houses down. So that's the content. The language is the way the story is told. So it's the skillfulness and the artfulness in which the story is told. So instead of, for example, the language might be very simple. It might be in the Three Little Pigs, the wolf blew down the first pig's house, but it might be really complex and ornate as well. So the wolf huffed and he puffed, and he heaved a mountain of air from within his chest in order to blow the pig back to the dust from where he came. So you can see I upped the level of complexity there, and I made it a little more literarily complex in my second version. So the language is important because if the language is simple, the author might have done that for a reason, but if the language is complex, it also might be done for a specific reason or purpose. And we'll talk about that in our example that comes up in this slideshow. So the difference between content and language: content is the actual plot, what's going on, what you can see, what you can read, and then the language is how that content is portrayed. So again, if the author is using a lot of metaphors, if they're metaphor heavy, if they're description heavy, those are the things you're paying attention to. So you're looking for patterns in that, you're looking for patterns in both of these things. So are there subjects that come up, topics and themes that come up over and over again, or are there literary devices, when considering language, that are used over and over again? And when they are, examine that. Convey, so how do patterns of content and language shape the portrayal of the topic? And how do relationships between these patterns convey underlying meaning? So to convey means to show or to present. So you're going to be looking for these repeating ideas and for repeating language patterns, and you want to question them, and you want to say, what is this telling me about society? Because the underlying meaning is really mostly about the world we live in, about society. So what are these things in this text telling me about society? So the underlying meaning is the meaning that is not literally told in the story. So for example, the three little pigs, the literal meaning in the story, or the literal story itself, is about the pigs and the wolf again. But the underlying meaning, there might be a story, or there might be a meaning about predators in society, right? And they take advantage of the poor, those who can't afford a nice house, but not the rich, because the rich can afford to protect themselves. So now, in that simple little analysis, we move beyond just the simple story. So we're going to be taking this essential question, all this on this page, and these words, and we're going to be applying it to stories as we move through the quarter. We will take different kind of frameworks and use them, so different styles of literary analysis. But for this week, just focus on what is the meaning besides just the story in the text. How do I get beyond just the story being told? What is being said about society? So the instructions now is that you should pause this video, pause the lesson, and read the La Llorona below. It's a New Mexico kind of urban legend folklore piece about a couple and the ghost of the wife in this couple. So read this now and just read it for the story. Read it very basically as you might always read something. So don't do what I was just talking about. Just read the story. And then when you're done, be prepared on the next page to go through a lesson and how we can move beyond just the story, using our guiding question here, using our essential question. So go ahead and pause the video, because I'm going to keep going in the video, and I want you to have read this story. Okay, now that you've read La Llorona, I'm going to kind of go through this page and my notes that I took and gave to you guys. So you should have read it, so you should know the basic idea that there are multiple days in the story, and that the woman eventually kills herself trying to save her children, and all that noise, right? Okay, so here's what I did. I took some of the vocab words that we had, mostly patterns, and then content and language, although they're all related because I'm looking for patterns of both content and language. So I color-coded the patterns with this red, the content with the blue, and the language with this kind of tan color. And what I noticed, is first that there was a pattern of the passage of time. Because you start with, once there was a poor man, and then when he found out, he was angry. After the birth of his son, so it's moving very quickly, like once, after, several more sons were born, the day, the very next night, night after night. So I highlighted all the passage of time markers, because I feel like that might be important when I'm trying to look beyond just the story. I noticed this pattern of being too poor. There was a poor man. He's almost always described as a poor man, and then it often says too poor. So I said poor man, too poor, too weak, poor man, poor man, poor man, over and over again, right? So there's this idea of being too poor. So I think being poor, poverty, not having a lot of money, financial well-being is an important idea to this story. And then there was the repetition of death. The kids, their sons and their daughters, the husband keeps killing them, so that happens. But then the wife dies trying to save and do something positive for once. And then even the husband dies trying to, get at the spirit of the wife, trying to shut her up, basically. So death is important to the story. And I think even death and being too poor they're linked. I think if I'm reading this very critically, if I'm doing literary analysis, I need to realize that death and poverty are huge ideas here. They're huge pieces of the content. And then lastly, number 4, each character's madness. I just noticed that there was a pattern because both characters, each of their madnesses, if you want to call it that, drives them to try to swim. But swimming is something that they cannot do, so they die. Both of them drown. So that's interesting to me. Also, other things of the content, so the passage of time, I rewrote that as the progression of the story. we have just the plot, right? The disagreement between man and wife, and then we have this consistent failure to resolve their conflict about wanting kids, and then death is the result of this conflict even existing. As far as the language goes, this story is very simple. It has strong verbs, and I highlighted them in tan. We have pleaded in vain, swept away, terrified, begged, wailing and ringing, etc., etc. And then we have the simple sentence structure, right? There's not even a single semicolon in here. There's only a few complex sentences. There's the use of superlatives, so too weak, too poor, and then the repetition of these. I mean, that's a language structure, so as much as it is just a basic pattern. And then we have literal use of supernatural elements. So this isn't figurative. It's not like, and the ghost of my wife came into my memory. It's not like something that's realistic. It's a literal ghost that this man is dealing with. So that seems important. So we're literally using the supernatural. Okay. So I kind of went through our essential guiding question there, and I broke down the parts that I talked about previously in this lesson. What were the patterns that I noticed when I read La Llorona? What was the content that was presented? And then how is language used? So I condensed that not all of it actually, I only took a few ideas. You'll often find that when you take notes for literary analysis. You'll take a bunch of notes, and then you'll take one or two or maybe three ideas and use those in, a small piece of writing or something. So here's what I said. Because what you're really trying to do here, the ultimate goal, is to look for underlying meanings or greater meanings. And I said I could examine how La Llorona, as a New Mexico folktale, seems to provide a prejudiced view of poorer families in society. Instead of being just a simple story about a man who keeps killing his own children, the story takes on a new and deeper meanings. For example, the man seems to represent the fear of being inadequate that many men have, and his particular situation shows him unable to provide for his family. This is particularly demeaning and takes away from a man's confidence. The language of this text reinforces this notion of inadequacy. The man is described as too poor many times throughout the text. And I could go on and on and on with this analysis, and I would even say the language itself is simple, which also reflects the idea that they're poor and maybe, and this is a very negative thing within the story, it's not my idea, but maybe the story is trying to say if you're poor, we have to talk about you in simple sentences because that's the only way that the poor will understand such a thing. And in this case, I would look at this text as, potentially racist or prejudiced or even classist, meaning it's against the lower class, right? So that's just a very quick example I took notes on. Here's what I did just to recap what you're going to do with the Little Red Riding Hood. I looked for patterns in the text. And then I looked at the content and I tried to decide what is going on in the story and then what is being repeated within the story. Because whatever's being repeated is what I should pay attention to when I look for the greater meaning. And then there's language, and language is important because it helps you determine what to focus on. If there's repetition, use of metaphor, things like that. So first I broke it down into those three main concepts, and then I kind of considered the story as a whole, and especially the repeating things, the patterns, and I asked myself, what does this tell me about the world? What does this tell me about society? What does this tell me about man's role in society? What does this tell me about women's roles in society? And you could ask these questions over and over and over again. They are endless. So don't worry too much about what direction you go when you do the Little Red Riding Hood. Just kind of pick one thread like I did. The thread that I picked was the idea of man's inadequacy. So this is more than just a story. It's a presentation of man's inadequacy and what happens when a man is left feeling inadequate. And in this case, he felt too poor. So I think that's the greater meaning right there, among many other greater meanings that could be hidden in this story. So your job, because I just said the word hidden, is to unlock the greater meanings of the Little Red Riding Hood for this week. Thank you.